I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, MacArthur Fellow and feminist political economic historian, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. In one of her essays for The New Yorker, she wrote, "By now it should be clear what the demands of young Black people are: an end to racism, police abuse, and violence, and the right to be free of the economic coercion of poverty and inequality." She points out that these struggles are far from new, in fact, quite the contrary. In her recent book, Race for Profit, she traced how the housing market transitioned from exclusion through redlining to predatory inclusion, which has adversely impacted Black families for generations and continues to do so. Dr. Taylor points out that we must end the recycled ideas that lead to nowhere, that real change is needed, and that it is America that needs to change. Our socio-political and economic systems steeped in oppressive economic stratification and racism need true reform. Professor Taylor, on behalf of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, welcome to Colorado and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I feel like my talk is done. That in many ways that is an outline of my remarks today. So what I'm going to do is talk somewhere between 30 and 35 minutes. And my talk is really looking at the racial wealth gap and poverty in the United States today, and how we fundamentally address these issues, not only by looking at their contemporary manifestations, looking at how historically these problems took form and came into existence in the first place, and what that means for our political struggles to transform them, not just reform them, but transform them fundamentally. Over the last several years, the racial wealth gap has come into focus as an explanation for many of the disparities that continue to shape Black life chances in comparison to their white peers. It has emerged as a serious focal point of public policy conversations about opening greater opportunities for African Americans and ending the ongoing legacy of racial discrimination. Today, I want to talk about the racial wealth gap, what it is, why it exists, but also why it is an insufficient discussion point in understanding both racial inequality and understanding that racial inequality reflects a much larger problem of wealth inequality in our society more broadly. And this, of course, includes poverty. While many have become comfortable discussing the term systemic racism since the summer of 2020, many more have been uncomfortable in naming the system that has been implicated. Indeed, by focusing narrowly on wealth gaps and other ways that African Americans, Latinx, and Indigenous people are estranged or excluded from economic opportunities, we may be missing the larger story of how our entire economic system is designed to perpetuate low wages, economic insecurity, and yes, poverty. There are 614 billionaires in the United States, precisely because there are 35 million poor people in the United States, not counting the low income, the struggling to get by, and other ordinary people. They are fantastically rich because others are fantastically poor. It is not a tale of two countries or two cities or two states. It is one country where the spoils of work and labor are not fairly distributed. But the myopia around gaps and exclusion deflect from a larger discussion about the inequities embedded in American capitalism and the ways that our economic system threatens the health, safety, and livelihood of all ordinary people. This, of course, doesn't mean that racism and discrimination are not important. Quite the contrary. They are critical in two primary ways. One, as a way of understanding why there are such enormous material gulfs in the lives of ordinary Black people compared to their peers. And two, The appearance that poverty and economic deprivation is Black or brown has facilitated explanations that blame people within those communities for their own hardships. When poverty disproportionately exists with a Black or brown face, it has been easier to claim that it is something endemic to those people as opposed to something systemic. In this way, racism helps to maintain the status quo by fostering blame of individuals. But the larger issues are why and how poverty can continue to exist in a society as rich as the one that we live in. By focusing on the racial wealth gap instead of larger patterns of inequality in this society, we can limit the discussion of how we include Black people. We can limit the discussion to how we can include Black people into more governing and financial institutions within the US, while not necessarily interrogating the systems into which we are suggesting that Black and brown people be integrated into. What is the racial wealth gap? Wealth is the sum total of one's assets after all debt has been accounted for. For every dollar a typical white household has, a Black one has 12 cents, a divide that has grown over the last half century. The net worth of a typical white family is $171,000, nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family at $17,000. The racial wealth gap remains even for families with the same income. In the top 10% of income, only 3.5%, which includes only 3.5% African Americans, the racial wealth gap is still quite large. Median net worth for white families in this income group is $1.8 million versus $343,000 for Black families. A racial gap exists in every income group, except, of course, the bottom quintile, which includes 24% of African Americans, where median net worth is 0 for everyone. Why does this gap exist? There is no single definitive explanation for the racial wealth gap, but along the way, all of the ways in which one becomes indebted, makes an income, and all other exchanges, these are typically mediated by race and class. African Americans are disproportionately working class and poor. The Black poverty rate is 18% compared to 10% for white Americans. Black workers in the US earn on average 30% or $10,000 less than white workers, and nearly half of Black workers are employed in the healthcare, retail, accommodation, and food service industries, with the vast majority in lower paying service roles instead of professional or managerial roles. The annual median wage of all US workers is about $42,000. 43% of Black workers earn less than $30,000 per year, highlighting how they are overrepresented in low-paying jobs. So while Black Americans are underrepresented in high-paying professions, are also underrepresented in high-paying professions. Only 5% of physicians are Black, and just 4.5% of software developers are Black. So when Black workers are stuck in place with income, stagnating income, then we see that there is an impossibility of saving, investing, or taking actions that are prescribed for multiplying one's income into personal wealth. But the entire focus on saving and financial literacy ignore how lower incomes and lack of savings can have cascading impacts in the lives of poor and working class people. It means that you live in a world marked by fragility, an inability to fix a car, to weather a healthcare crisis, to weather a hike in your rent, a hike in property taxes. All of these things can conspire to throw the precarious balance, financial balance, into disarray. Lower incomes and a lack of discretionary funds create havoc and ultimately can lead to even higher debts. the lack of stability in housing is especially consequential. To begin with, most African Americans are renters, and being a renter in the United States right now is extremely disadvantageous. By all accounts, the US continues to face an affordable housing crisis. Last summer, rents in the US reached their highest level ever of $1,200 for rent. So even as wages and salaries have incrementally risen over the last 40 years, rents have risen exponentially. In just the last year alone, there has been a 10% increase in rents across the country. More than 50% of Black renters are rent burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income on monthly rent. It means that Black residents are particularly vulnerable to displacement and eviction. Nationally, on average, eviction filing rates against Black renters are about twice as high as what we see for white renters. Black renters have lower incomes. They have less stable employment as well. They have less in savings, and they're less able to call on family ties to provide financial support in the event of an emergency. African Americans make up 21% of all renters, but constitute 35% of all defendants on eviction cases. And as Matt Desmond, the sociologist who studies evictions at Princeton, has argued, eviction is not just a reflection of poverty. It creates poverty through displacement, dispossession, and the trauma of becoming homeless. In one sense, this is why the scramble for home ownership is so intense in Black communities. People want housing stability. But despite all of the talk about home ownership, only 44% of African Americans own their own homes. This is compared to more than 70% of white Americans. So all of the benefits regarding taxes and built equity over time, the vast majority of African Americans miss out on this. But even among existing Black homeowners, the benefits of home ownership do not accrue to them equally in comparison to their white peers. Black people are often targeted for more expensive loans, predatory loans. Black families may have to pay more upfront because of credit records that do not account for discriminatory factors in their work and debt histories of Black families. But once in a house, properties in Black majority neighborhoods are valued differently than in white majority neighborhoods, creating higher equity and a more valuable asset from which white families can draw against in comparison to Black families. So when analysts and experts focus on creating more Black homeowners as the solution to the so-called racial wealth gap, they are most certainly, and often calling for this as a solution to poverty as well, they are most certainly not taking into account how Black properties are devalued to such an extent that even as a homeowner, it is unlikely that African Americans would ever catch up in wealth simply by owning a home. The gap in housing that found that homes in majority Black neighborhoods, when we're talking about the gap in housing value, studies have found that in homes in majority Black neighborhoods have been undervalued by, and on average, $48,000 compared with homes in neighborhoods where fewer than 1% of the residents are Black. Another study found that the difference in average home appraisals between neighborhoods that are majority white and those that are majority Black or Latinx has doubled since 1980. In 2017 alone, a study conducted by Andre Perry of the Brookings Institute found that $156 billion was lost in equity for homeowners simply because they lived in Black majority neighborhoods. So the racial wealth gap is real, and there is not a single thing that anyone can point to and say that this is the reason why. Instead, it is the cumulative total of two things. One, is that it reflects the inequality that Black workers face in wages and salaries and the disproportionate amount of debt that they take on as a result. Basically, African Americans must debt manage inequality to bridge the gap in lower wages and higher expenses. This means taking on loans, often predatory, relying on credit cards, often with sky-high interest rates, taking on student loans, and other means to bridge the income gap. Not only does this make wealth accumulation impossible, but it makes simply saving completely unrealistic. Financial success has been interpreted as personal achievement for white citizens. White people have been led to believe that greater wealth accumulation and lower rates of poverty are driven by personal choice and habits that are better than Black and brown people. It is an explanation that consistently obscures the ways that white people were historically advantaged, but also the ways that ordinary white people also suffer from inequality while walking on fragile economic ground. The racialization of wealth and poverty and the ingrained ideas that wealth is white and poverty is Black in the US has sown confusion, has made inequality appear to be the natural state of things, and has undermined solidarities necessary to build the kinds of political coalitions, political commitments, and political action necessary to fight for a fair distribution of wealth and resources in the United States. The second reason for the racialized wealth gap and disproportionate levels of Black and brown poverty and equality is historical. The history of racism, dispossession, segregation, extraction, and economic exploitation has animated the entirety of Black life since the abolition of slavery. But not only did these factors create poverty among Black people, but they have combined to mark African Americans as inferior. That is to say, the social effects of these public policies in combination with the private actions of business not only impoverished Black communities, but without the actions taken by these institutions being fully understood, the conditions created by public policy and by the actions of the private sector, those conditions were blamed on problems believed to be intrinsic to Black communities and Black people. Only in very rare and sometimes fleeting moments do we examine the material roots to Black inequality. Most of the time, those conditions of inequality and the inequity itself is blamed on Black family structures, Black culture, Black men, Black women, Black children, or something intrinsic to these people, and not the institutions that provide access to capital and opportunity. Consider Black people were emancipated from slavery and given absolutely nothing. No clothing, no land, no money, no jobs. The Southern elite relied on the threat of starvation among African Americans to compel them to return to their old jobs as slaves and to work for next to nothing in terms of wages, what some have described as slavery by another name. Where the threat of starvation did not work, in some cases, the Southern elite used the law to force Black people back into work through convict leasing programs. The economic, political, and social oppression of Black workers made them appear to be inferior to whites. When African Americans began to migrate out of the rural South into larger cities across the country, they were confronted with racist mob violence that relegated them to certain neighborhoods and certain jobs. The neighborhoods became overcrowded. City officials often refused to perform basic city services, including cleaning, trash pickup in Black neighborhoods. Landlords, knowing that Black renters had nowhere else that they could move, refused to do basic maintenance, allowing the homes and buildings that Black people lived in to fall into disrepair. Banks refused loans to Black people who wanted to buy and invest in their neighborhoods. But the policies and actions of the private sector that allowed for the deterioration of these neighborhoods was not known or understood. A popular narrative became that Black people do not care about their property, do not care about the condition of their neighborhoods that they live in. And these conditions of disrepair and dilapidation brought on through landlord and institutional neglect were blamed on Black people and ultimately would become the pretext for banks to designate Black people and their neighborhoods as more risky. Notions of risk, though, were attached to people, not just the neighborhoods they lived in. So all of this history I'm talking about is in the early 20th century, really until the law, was formally changed in the 1960s with the Fair Housing Act. Historian Khalil Muhammad, in his important book, The Condemnation of Blackness, which is written about the Gilded Age, really the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century and up through the 1920s. What he wrote in this book, what he's written in the book is about how social scientists, elected officials, and other upstanding officials, how they distorted new statistics that were produced in the late 19th century census reports that showed African Americans to be vulnerable to illness, and that also showed African Americans to be overrepresented amongst those convicted for crimes. Of course, within this discourse of statistics in the late 19th and early 20th century, no one entertained the idea that Black people were actually victims of racism and discrimination by employers and police. Instead, those numbers were interpreted for the public as evidence that Black people were dangerous, as risks for spreading disease and committing crimes. Indeed, segregation in the early 20th century outside of the Deep South was justified because of these characterizations, because of the conditions that were attributed to disease and criminality among African Americans through the distortion of census information. When the US first began to form its welfare state in the 1930s, it did so, as Ira Katznelson has reminded us, by excluding most African Americans from its most important gains. Why? To appease Southern politicians who feared that the emergence of a welfare state would mean that Black workers would no longer tolerate starvation wages that they were being paid by white employers. But the main programs, including Social Security, new home ownership programs, and ultimately the Veterans Bill, the GI Bill after World War II, carved African Americans out of the most important gains being created by this social welfare state in the 1940s and in the post-war 1940s. It would take the civil rights movement and the uprisings of the 1960s to change this and force the federal government to shift from exclusion as Black people demanded inclusion into American affluence and what was then understood as the American dream. But it is also important to examine why exclusionary and exploitative practices continued after the passage of the most important civil rights legislation since the end of the Civil War in the 1960s. It doesn't mean that those protests were futile, obviously. They were critical towards advancing a material explanation for Black inequality. And what I mean here is that prior to this moment in civil rights, Black inequality was accepted as a feature or as a consequence of Black inferiority. And so there were debates over whether the problems with African Americans were cultural or biological, but there was no kind of systematic understanding of the material roots to disproportionate levels of Black poverty. Then as now, radicals, including someone like Martin Luther King Jr., linked Black poverty to pervasive racial discrimination, from public schools to employment opportunities to the availability of good housing. They also showed that there were financial interests that benefited from maintaining Black inequality. Black radicals described the financial plight of ordinary Black people as evidence that their communities were colonies within the US. Internal colonialism, as some referred to the particular oppressive conditions faced by Black people, could be found with white landlords charging exorbitant rents for rat-infested apartments, and in rent-to-own stores demanding unconscionable interest rates, all because African Americans were a captured market, isolated by relentless residential segregation. In response to this kind of organized theft, Black radicals like Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, and Charles V. Hamilton coined the term institutional racism in their seminal book, Black Power, published in 1967. Carmichael and Hamilton distinguished between individual acts of racism and the dispassionate institutional variety, in which the attitudes of the perpetuators were less important than the outcomes in the lives of ordinary Black people. They described institutional racism as, quote, less overt, more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but that it was no less destructive of human life. Carmichael and Hamilton went on to describe how institutional racism, quote, kept Black people locked in dilapidated slum tenements, subject to the daily prey of exploitative landlords, merchants, loan sharks, and discriminatory real estate agents. The society either pretends it does not know of this latter situation, or it is in fact incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. The recognition of institutional racism as a controlling factor in Black inequality, rather than some pernicious culture of poverty, pointed to the need for institutional solutions. This was the backdrop of the Johnson administration's vast expansion of the federal government. From 1963 through 1968, Congress, at the president's urging, passed nearly 200 pieces of legislation as part of the war on poverty and the Great Society, from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to food stamps and Medicare. These programs created a bottom through which average citizens could not fall. Spending on anti-poverty programs grew by tens of billions of dollars during the 1960s, producing dramatic declines in the number of people living in poverty across the country. So much so, but by the early 1970s, the poverty rate had dropped to 11% from a high of 22% in 1959, when the government began tracking these numbers. Well, this kind of safety net was created. Johnson liberals also expected what they described as, quote, the genius of private industry to fuel employment opportunities for Blacks in ways that the post-war economic boom had created, had utilized to create a white middle class. But by the late 1960s, the economy was changing, and the good union jobs that had been the foundation of the American dream had left cities for the suburbs and beyond. And when in the early 1970s, the long post-war economic expansion turned into economic recession, the boom was over for African-American workers, was over before African-American workers could ever really gainfully participate. So just as legal discrimination was ending and federal oversight agencies were underway, things like the EEOC, the Civil Rights Division of HUD, the economic fortunes in the country had transformed. The narrow focus on equality or simply inclusion into this economic order did not necessarily interrogate what was it that African Americans were being integrated into. And moreover, the failure to seriously repair and redress the decades of legal discrimination and their social, political, and economic impacts in Black life meant that just changing the law from exclusion to inclusion was not enough. In fact, those harms created by years of legal discrimination were newly interpreted as risk or marked as unqualified, allowing for ordinary Black people to continue to be treated differently in the marketplace and elsewhere. Instead, the removal of race from the law allowed state institutions and in the private sector to argue that racism was no longer an impediment to African Americans and that the US had entered into a period of colorblindness. But declaring colorblindness without repairing the damage created by centuries of acute color awareness and legal racial subjugation erased the structural explanations for the systemic discrimination endured by African Americans. And without the pressure of political protests, the political right, seized the opportunity to revive old scripts, assigning blame for the conditions in Black communities to Black people, Black families, and what they described as a culture of poverty. This wasn't just about punishing Black people, but reasserting the supremacy of a market economy while minimizing the role of government and mitigating forms of inequality. This meant also facilitating the growth and development of a Black middle class as a kind of visible proof that our system could work for African Americans while reinforcing the idea that Black poverty was self-induced. These were the reigning politics during the Reagan age, where the gulf between rich and poor more generally began to widen. But the myopic focus on Black poverty, recast as a new underclass, distorted the ways that all workers were falling behind in this new economy. 2 years into Reagan's first term, Black unemployment had risen to 21%. By 1983, it would go no lower than 10% by the end of the decade. The 1982 poverty rate of 14% was the highest since 1965 at the start of the Johnson's War on Poverty, when it was 17%. But for African Americans, the bottom was falling out as poverty consumed an astounding 30% of the population. But white supremacy, if we can think about that in terms of the disproportionate levels of poverty and hardship concentrated in Black communities, has never existed for its own sake. It has always been yoked to a larger objective of social control to the benefit of a white elite, and more social control and manipulation for ordinary Black and brown people, but ordinary white people as well. Anyone who thinks, for example, most recently, the antics of the Trump administration and the Republican Party writ large is only about race, is thinking too narrowly and ignoring that this tempest of racism and white nationalism has been happening within the larger whirlwind of class warfare. What does class warfare look like? Well, it's not the envy and jealousy that Republicans typically gesture to. It looks like the incomes of the top 5% of earners increasing faster than the incomes of other families. Since the Great Recession of 2008, the richest families, the top 5%, are the only ones to have gained wealth since then. From 2007 to 2016, the median net worth of the richest 20% of Americans increased 13% to $1.2 million. Meanwhile, the greatest loss of wealth, 39%, came from families who saw their net worth drop from $32,000 in 1997 to $19,000 in 2016. As a result, the wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families more than doubled from 1989 to 2016. In 1989, the richest 5% of families had 114 times as much wealth as families in the bottom 20%. By 2016, this ratio had increased to 248. This enormous shift in wealth and resources from the bottom to the top, has come with the steady erosion of public programs. The erosion, in some cases, the absolute demolition of the public sector and social programs aimed at easing inequality, has been hastened by the cynical invocation of race and the demonization of poor and working class families, Black families. Even where white families have benefited from meager resources, the United States offers to the poor and dispossessed a bipartisan effort to paint various welfare programs as the root of the supposed indolence of unwed and uneducated Black mothers was deployed to undermine welfare as an entitlement for both Black and white families. When poverty and wealth are racialized and the focus is simply on closing gaps without interrogating the larger system within which it operates, and the larger system that not only creates a racial wealth gap, but systematically encourages an unbridgeable gulf between rich and poor. The narrowed focus casts a dark shadow on the diminishing standard of living and life chances of ordinary white people as well. In the last several years, the life expectancy of ordinary white people has gone in reverse, something unheard of in the developed world. Instead, ordinary whites have been dying of alcoholism, opioid addiction, and suicide, hardly the hallmarks of a privileged existence. This doesn't mean that their circumstance is the same as Black or brown people, but in the constant comparison between ordinary white people and ordinary Black people, we can miss how inequality, racism, dispossession, disposability, and marginalization are central features of American capitalism, destroying the futures of most people who do not hold wealth, power, or influence in our society. We continue to miss that consider that US billionaires have seen their wealth surge by almost $2 trillion during the pandemic, their collective fortune skyrocketing by nearly 2/3, just short of $3 trillion at the start of the COVID crisis in March of 2020 to almost $5 trillion in August of 2021. These stark realities periodically come into view through social protest and upheaval. It was the case in the 1930s, again with the social movements and uprisings in the 1960s, with the eruption of Occupy Wall Street a decade ago, and now again with the largest protests in American history in the summer of 2020. Social movements and protests open up the space for more complicated explanations of our social order. They expose the underlying factors for the persistence of conditions that in other times seem immutable, almost natural. But we can also see from last summer that they don't resolve themselves. The basic premise of liberalism, that simply knowing the answer and revealing injustice alone can help solve the problem, is wrong. Since the 2008 crisis and the eruption of Occupy Wall Street, the crisis in American capitalism, the simultaneous growth of income inequality alongside racist police brutality and rampant racial injustice have not self-corrected. It not only requires political protest and social movements, but building political parties and organizations that can win and convince larger majorities to the ideas that we must redistribute the wealth, that housing is a human right, that healthcare is a human right, that trillion-dollar military budgets are a sign of a failed society, and that the majority have the right to determine the use of our wealth and resources. These ideas don't just come out of thin air. They are politics and they have to be fought for. And we cannot fight if we don't have political parties and organizations that have the size and capacity to organize around our ideas for a different kind of society where poverty and inequality and racism is no longer a feature accepted as part of the landscape. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for those remarks today. Truly powerful, thought-provoking. I know my mind is spinning with everything you've said. Just a tremendous amount of context there and content. And yeah, as everyone else is, I'm sure, in that same spot, please give it some thought. Think about what questions you may have. We've got a few in the Q&A. box already, we'll go through those. But if you have another question as you're processing through everything that we just heard, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can here. So without further ado, I'm going to start just reading through the questions. Dr. Taylor, you can see them in the Q&A box too if you like. Might be a little easier to read them too, but I'll read them one at a time, and we'll just go in the order that they came in. And I'm going to start with one from Shar. It says, well, many acknowledge that your zip code should not determine your future. That leads some to believe that the answer is to help families to relocate to areas where there are more jobs and or neighborhoods with more amenities as compared or contrasted to reinvesting in the neighborhoods that people are currently living in. How do you respond to such recommendations?
Well, with these kind of things, and I sort of looked at some of this in my book, Race for Profit, where there were big debates in the late 1960s and 1970s. Should African Americans go to the suburbs and integrate into the suburbs where these existing resources were, or should the cities be gilded? Should the cities be rebuilt? And my question that I posed in the book, and that I think it continues to be relevant as these kind of move to opportunity programs continue to be popular, is why do we have to choose? I mean, seriously, when we have the tremendous amount of wealth and resources in this country, why do we have to choose to either develop the places where poor people and working class people are currently living, or do people have to simply pick up and move to be able to access those resources? Obviously, people should have the ability to live wherever it is that they want to live, but you shouldn't have to move in order to have access to good schools, in order to have access to good jobs, in order to be able to live a meaningful life. I think that we have the kind of wealth and resources to make that happen in every locality in the United States. But it will require a different set of priorities. It will require us to prioritize development, sometimes for development's sake, not to attract business, not for the sake of trying to attract one kind of high tax paying population, while other people be damned, but it require that we have a general approach to development, that we reject the idea that there should be good or bad neighborhoods. And so part of my argument in my book, and certainly in all of the things that I write about, is that we have to expand our minds beyond the current structures, programs, solutions that are on offer, because most of those solutions, programs, structures exist in a very small space, and they're not thinking expansively. They're not thinking about the enormous resources that could be utilized. They're thinking about how the pie is currently constituted. And when I say in my talk that it is a moral failure, it is a social failure to have a defense budget that is almost $1 trillion, while we debate whether we can have some development in North Philadelphia, or does everyone need to move to the Philadelphia suburbs. We should be able to do both. And to do both and to demand both means thinking differently about the resources that are available, not limiting ourselves to the existing programs, pot of money, and structures that currently exist.
No, that's a tremendous answer. Thank you so much for that. I'll move on to the next question, which is a very short question that could have an enormous answer. So
I'll try to be shorter, brief.
Yeah, no, it's okay. This is be very open-ended, I think. What might an effective policy response look like for addressing these types of issues of predatory inclusion?
Sure, that's a great question. I always, with that kind of question, I always start with, I think that the easiest thing to do would be to enforce the laws that we currently have on the books, right? It has been illegal. And I'm thinking about predatory inclusion in housing or in the distribution of credit. It has been illegal since 1968 to discriminate on the basis of race and the buying, selling, renting, financing of housing. It has been illegal since 1974 to discriminate on the basis of race and gender and the distribution of credit. And so we have many laws on the books, but the question we should always come back to is, why are those laws not enforced? Why is the kind of onus on those who have been victimized, those who have been discriminated against, to bring their case in order to correct the actions in the private sector? And so this was a problem from the very inception in housing in particular. When HUD was, when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, HUD was given the capacity to create a civil rights division, which was tasked with enforcing the new fair housing law. HUD was given $6 million to set that office up. $5 million went towards staffing, which left $1 million for to investigate claims of housing discrimination in the United States. On its face, it was not a serious effort to do so. And since then, and that may have been the most serious effort that the federal government has placed in enforcement of its anti-discrimination laws. When you look at the EEOC and all of these oversight agencies that I reference, shoestring budgets, right? Low staffing. And so if these are the safety nets, if these are the institutions, the resources that we have to not just investigate claims of discrimination, but to pursue cases and then to enforce penalties, then they are criminally underutilized, under-resourced, and incapable of carrying out that mandate. And so I always say that to begin with, in terms of how do we confront these issues, is that we have to give our regulatory agencies the resources, the people, and the prowess to actually regulate and to do their jobs. And when that's not happening, we have to ask why that is. And it often has to do with the influence of the private sector. Sometimes we refer to this as agency capture, where the influence of the private sector is so overwhelming that, and the relationship, the conceived relationship between public agencies and private enterprise is such that it complicates the efforts of public agencies to enforce the rules, because they are in partnership with private sector forces. So we have to have independent public agencies that can adequately actually enforce the rules and enforce the regulations. And we have to re-examine the relationship between the private sector industries that these organizations are tasked with regulating in the first place.
Yeah, I think many of my colleagues here at CCLP and our partners at Colorado Legal Services and our partners in state government, many of whom are on this call, would definitely identify and sympathize with those remarks and the under-resourcing of enforcement for sure. So it's definitely a huge issue. Moving on to the next question. It says, in Colorado, as across the country in many places, housing costs are skyrocketing while wages stagnate. Safe and affordable housing is out of reach for all but a dwindling minority of individuals, and eviction is a constant threat for renters across our state. what systemic changes would we need to see in order to build communities that not only have what they need to survive, but to thrive?
I mean, that's the question. That's the question of the hour. I think there are a few things. One is to understand the nature of the problem, right? And to me, the core issue of the problem is that we have a laissez-faire approach to housing in this country. And what I mean is that there are absolutely no checks on what the market, what landlords, what real estate corporations can charge people to live somewhere. And when you have that in combination with other factors, when you have a housing market that is closed to working class people because of the exponential increase, I mean, you have housing markets, home ownership markets, where the prices are have dramatically jumped by 30% in the last calendar year. And this means that these are no longer options for poor or working class people. When you have big corporate hedge funds, Blackstone, buying up all the cheap houses on the market, the relatively cheap houses that the industry refers to as starter homes, in order to flip them as rentals, then that becomes even harder. The home ownership market becomes smaller. Now it's more expensive, making it even more difficult for ordinary people to enter. And what does that say then to those who exercise power in the rental market? It means you can charge whatever you want because you have the captive market, right? There is nowhere that human beings must have shelter. You must have housing. So it is often like prescription medicine or healthcare. You pay the price. You have no choice. And so when you have that kind of dynamic, and that is the market, then all hell breaks loose, right? And there's no price controls. There's no influence or control. So what does that mean that has to happen? We have to have the federal government reimpose itself in the housing market. And that means using, again, to scale the resources of the federal government to build and create housing for people. The private sector helped to do, the real estate and housing industry helped to destroy the name of public housing in the US. The private sector throughout the post-war era lobbied successfully to have public housing take on a prison-like character. They helped to change the rules. They lobbied to change the rules where public housing would be the housing of last resort. It wouldn't be housing for working class people, working poor people. It would be housing for people who were utterly destitute. So it drove down the numbers. And then they set up a program where the maintenance of public housing was not tied to what was needed to maintain those structures. The budgets for maintaining those structures was tied to the number of people living in the structure, and it was taken out of their rent instead of having a separate budget line. And so that meant that as buildings fell into disrepair and the population living in those buildings got smaller, it meant that there was less money available to keep those buildings in good repair. And that was all done on purpose to destroy the idea of government-backed housing in the United States and to create the impression that the market was the only way to develop and create housing in the US. And so now we have this housing disaster. And so what we need to do is we need to build 12 million units of public housing. We need publicly subsidized housing. We need to use, again, the resources and the power of the state to fix this. We have been tinkering for 50 years, since the 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act, with private sector development of affordable housing. It is a failure. It is a failure because on scale, it's not that they can't create enough housing, but who wants to build housing for poor and working class people? In every major city in the US, there are cranes and massive buildings. And what are they building? They are building $1 million condos. That's what they're building. They are building housing on the upper end of the wage and salary scale, because that's where the money is. There is no money in building housing for poor people. That's why it doesn't happen. And so it's the government, it's the state that is really the only entity that can fill that void. Having a few cute boutique programs, oh, we'll build 40 units here, we'll build 100 units there, we'll put 6 units in this building, we'll put 50 units. No one ever proposes that, but we'll put 50. There's a crisis. These are drops in the bucket that don't begin to address that. But again, sometimes we limit ourselves to their logic of accepting drops in the bucket. And sometimes you have to accept a drop in the bucket, but we can't limit ourselves to that. There is an absolute housing, to call it a crisis is to continue to underestimate the catastrophic situation that we face, from evictions to foreclosures to just not being able to afford the rent. And, this is again another example of a problem that we can't solve with the existing pot of money, the existing structures that we are told we have to figure it out with. We have to think much bigger about these issues.
Again, a wonderful answer, Dr. Taylor. I mean, really tremendous stuff. And we've got a few more questions, I'm sure. Everybody would love to hear your answers. Do you have just another minute to take maybe one or two more, just really short? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, folks can stick with us. I know we're at the hour. If you have to hop off, do so. But
I appreciate the interest.
Yeah, no, there's a ton, which is not unexpected. This is a thoughtful group, of course. So let me just give you one more here and maybe two more, and we'll see if you have a short answer, and then we can wrap up. So I'm just going to pick a couple. This one says, a lot of our history about institutional racism is based on basic attitudes. How do we go about changing attitudes? Which I think is a little bit different than the other questions we've had, but I think it's a great question. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that the question about attitudes is important, because I think a lot of times, importantly, we focus on institutions and structures because a lot of times the people in positions of power like to attribute racism only to attitudes and behavior, and thinking that segregation is really a reflection of where people want to live, and not the activity and actions of banks and lenders and builders. On the other hand, I think attitudes and changing behavior is important. And I think for me, that's one of the most important parts of social movements and protests, because it forces the public to have a deeper engagement with the issues than one gets just in daily life, reading the newspaper or looking at a particular story. A social movement forces the mainstream media, forces elected officials to move beyond sound bites, to move beyond a kind of surface explanation for things, and forces a much more deeper engagement. I mean, I think that we can all go back to the summer of 2020 and see how over the course of the summer that, we go from a series of political demonstrations directed in response to what happened, the murder of George Floyd, to systemic racism, to understanding the role of the to police, to connecting all of this to the inept response of the federal government to the COVID crisis. None of that would have happened without political struggle on the ground. Now that has to end, that has to take up the questions that I talked about at the very end, which protest is not enough. We need organization. We need political parties that can systematically engage the public on our issues, on our perspectives. Think about how the right, from white supremacists to the fringiest parts of the right, own the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is a tool of these fringe individuals, and it is utilized to shape public opinion. How else do we end up in absurd conversations about critical race theory for months over the duration of the summer? All of these kind of distractions away from the material issues that the mass movement forced the public to engage with in the summer of 2020 without political vehicles of our own to you know, the way the right utilizes the Republican Party, we lose the capacity to shape and systematically over a long period of time engage people on these important political issues. So it's protest, it's organizing, it's activism, and it's building organizations and political parties that reflect the politics that we have and that we want to advance.
Absolutely. So one last one, just because I think it's related, and maybe I'll do the NPR thing and see if you can do a 30-second answer, but it's related to what you were just talking about. But one attendee says, I'm struck by your comments about how the racialization of poverty serves as a barrier to mobilizing poor white folks and building political power and anti-poverty coalitions across poor white folks and communities of color. Any sort of final thoughts on opportunities there, or examples of movements that have successfully overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think that that is a big challenge. I think that there started to be a fracture in this with the discussion of what are referred to as deaths by despair among white people. I think, unfortunately, again, in the hands of the mass media, it became kind of chasing around Trump voters, asking what they thought about various things, when that, you know, was not really the point, you know, and the kind of miscasting of poor and working class white people as Trump supporters, and really suppressing the fact that most Trump supporters making over $100,000 solidly in the middle class, if not wealthy white people. And I think that that is, you know, a challenge that we face, is understanding the ways that Black people are disproportionately poor in the United States. Absolutely no question or doubt about that. But when we talk about equality and integrating Black people into more tightly into our existing society, it's a way of conveying that the existing society is not the problem. The problem is solely the issue of exclusion and death by despair, white poverty, growing white insecurity that gets ignored in mainstream politics, which leaves people vulnerable to other sets of explanations, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's attacks on immigrants, means that is a crucial, urgent issue for people who are interested in building grassroots coalitions, mass movements to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll make that our last question because we're already a little over, but thank you on behalf of all of us at CCLP and everybody who is attending this webinar for spending a little bit of extra time, but also all of your time in general, and just for sharing your brilliance and your insights with us. I think it's given everybody here a lot to think about, and a lot of, you know, inspiration and resolve to keep working on the things we're working on. So thank you again, Dr. Taylor. Really appreciate having you with us today, and hopefully we'll be able to host you someday in person in Colorado in different times. And yeah, we'll see you then. And with that, I have our newly minted vice chair of the board for CCLP, who's going to hop on and just give us a quick couple of closing comments.
I guess it helps if I unmute myself. I'm Beatriz Bonet. I am the Vice Chair of the CCLP Board of Directors, and I wanted to thank everyone for attending this great event. I hope you enjoyed it. You enjoyed the Champion of Economic Justice Awards and our keynote speaker. Many of you, of course, have supported us through your ticket purchases and your sponsorships already. We really appreciate all your support. This is what makes events like this one possible in all of our work. All of us as members of the boards do devote significant time and energy to CCLP, and that's because we really, really believe in the mission of this great organization. And in closing, I would like to just ask you to join me in supporting CCLP. One of the best ways to support us so that we have a steady stream of income is if you can support us on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. And one way to do that recurring donation is by going to the CCLP website, and you can click on support our work. I believe that's a button on the top of the page. With that, please help us thank everyone for participating and for your support. Thank you again. And I hope you'll join me, not just now, but for many years to come. Thank you so much. Back to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Beatrice. And with that, that concludes 2021 Communities Against Poverty. We hope you've enjoyed this tremendous event. Thank you for attending. Thank you for supporting the event and for supporting CCLP. We appreciate you all so much, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.